To relate the history of the steamers of only the immediate district would be a lengthy undertaking. Today I will briefly recall some of the more important events of the boats that sail Kootenay waters, the dates they were built, the routes they traveled, and their final disposition, a scattering of notes on their construction. Some recollections of my own will serve to illustrate their colorful days over the calm waters of the lakes and the rough voyages down the fast waters of the rivers. Sternwheelers had been in service for many years to the immediate south on the lower Columbia, the Snake, Willamette, and other rivers. There was little difference in the design of those on the Washington and Oregon rivers and those on the lakes and rivers of the Kootenays. In fact, many of ours were built by pioneer rivermen who had earlier piloted the first ships up the uncharted Snake and Willamette. The first ships provided little more than transportation, with a minimum of comfort for the passengers. As river traffic increased, however, and larger boats were built, the accommodations were to become unsurpassed. Beautifully appointed dining rooms and staterooms provided luxurious comfort for the traveler. The sternwheeler, with a draft of 2.5 to 5 feet, was well suited to the shallow rapids of the rivers, where low water often made passage dangerous, and to beach landings where wharfs did not exist. The paddle wheel drew very little water, but its several paddles provided adequate power for the boat. External keels were not built into the hull, and as a result the steamers could be somewhat unwieldy in side winds. Occasionally several attempts would be made before successfully landing at a wharf. Generally 4 long rudders guided them. Only on one ship, on the Kootenay Lakes according to the records, only one ship on Kootenay Lakes according to the records was equipped with a power steering device, that being the early Kootenay and the Arrow Lakes. Hulls were of wooden construction, although the larger ships of later years were equipped with steel hulls, and 1 or 2 survivors of earlier days had steel sheathing placed over the wooden planking. Wood of small dimension was used in the superstructure, and one would wonder how such light construction could bear the weight of several decks. Bracing was used to strengthen the hull. Huge king posts set into the keelson extended up beyond the top deck, while other posts were set some distance from the center of the ship at an angle, and over these were drawn heavy cables, fixed at points at the stern and prow. The arrangement acted as a truss. Turnbuckles permitted adjusting the cables to maintain the correct shape of the hull. Paddle wheels were as large as 24 feet in diameter, driven by steam engines placed toward the rear of the main deck. Piston strokes were as long as 14 feet, and many engines were tandem compound, that is, high-pressure steam, after powering one cylinder, instead of being exhausted, was used again in a larger low-pressure cylinder. The huge boiler was placed toward the forward end of the ship, with a firebox toward the prow, and 2 firemen were usually required to keep steam up. 1 or 2 coal passers were employed to move coal from the bunker forward to within reach of the firemen. Steam from the boiler also provided power to run the electric generators and other auxiliary machinery, as well as provide heat for the ship. Saturated steam was used, and the exhaust from the stacks was muffled and wet. In the early years of the service, the ships used wood for fuel, and stops to replenish the supply of cordwood were frequent. Coal came into use around the turn of the century, and 1 or 2 ships were to have been converted to burn fuel oil. Low-voltage electric power provided illumination, and huge carbon arc lamps were used as searchlights when necessary during landing. Crews on the larger ships consisted of as many as 25 men, and on the longer runs included a mail clerk, who in his compartment handled the mail en route. An express messenger looked after the express company's business, and a freight clerk took care of freight shipments. 1 or 2 cooks in the galley situated on the main deck prepared the meals, served by 2 or more waiters under the supervision of the steward. Staterooms were situated along the sides of the second deck, and on the Bonington, Sycamoose, and the Sukin, with their additional decks and double-deck dining rooms, also along the sides of the third deck. These were accessible from a balcony above the floor of the dining room. The top deck provided quarters for various members of the crew. Ship's design progressed over the years until they became floating palaces, providing comfortable, restful transportation, but too slow to compete with the ever-increasing number of railroads. They were, though, however slow and cumbersome, largely responsible for the growth of our district, and without them the Kootenays would not have progressed as quickly as they did. The first steamer to ply the waters of the Columbia north of the international boundary was a 49, built below the border in 1865 by Captain Leonard White, a pioneer pilot who had taken the first steamers up the uncharted Snake, Willamette, and the lower Columbia. The 49's purpose was to carry men and materials to the gold rush in the Big Bend country north of Revelstoke. The little ship made only 3 trips, however, when mining activities ceased. Some 20 years were to pass before trading of any consequence was resumed. The CPR was building toward the coast. The Little Dispatch was built at Revelstoke by the Columbia Transportation Company to take care of the transportation requirements in the area. She was so successful that a new company, the Columbia and Kootenay Steam Navigation Company, was formed to finance the building of the Sternwheeler Lytton to assist with the increasing traffic on the Columbia River route. This fine ship was launched in May of 1890 at a cost of $40,000. Her first trip south was on July the 2nd, 1890, and it is interesting to note that her passenger list included William Van Horn of the CPR. As business increased, it was necessary to add to the small fleet with the purchase of the Kootenay, spelled A-I, which had lain idle below the boundary since 1885. She had also been used to carry materials north to the new transcontinental railway. Spokane Falls and Northern Railway, building toward the boundary and eventually to reach Nelson, had completed its line to the Little Dells south of Northport in 1890, and the steamers were to make connections with this line, giving a direct route from Spokane Falls into the Kootenays. Within a very short time, a network of waterways and short stretches of railway were to provide an efficient system of transportation within the West Kootenay district. The CPR had taken over and completed the Columbia and Kootenay Railway between Robson and Nelson in 1892. The C&KSN had in 1891 added 2 more ships, one the Columbia, built at Little Dells, and the other the Nelson for service on Kootenay Lake. 2 years later, in 1893, Spokane Falls and northern reached Nelson. The district boomed. Traffic increased with the discovery of new wealth, and more ships were added to the navigation company's fleet. There was some competition from other boats, such as the City of Ainsworth on Kootenay Lake, a screw steamer of 84 feet length. She sank twice within a year or so, and the second time was abandoned. There was other competition, too, for the CKSN in the form of the International Navigation and Trading Company, which entered the Kootenay Lake trade with a small screw steamer Caslow. In 1893, this same company built the first sternwheeler, the state of Idaho, at Bonner's Ferry, for the run up the Kootenay River to Kootenay Lake mining settlements. She was 140 feet in length. She sank at Ainsworth a few months later, but was raised, refitted, and renamed the Alberta, serving until going down again in 1905. The CKSN added another ship to Kootenay Lake in 1892 with the launching of the Sternwheeler Spokane, but she lasted only 2 years, burning at Castle in 1894. 2 years had passed when the Kootenay, built for the CKSN, made her trial run in May 1896. She was joined on Kootenay Lake by the International Navigation and Trading Companies International, built the same year. This company was now under control of the Great Northern, which had obtained a large interest in the British Finance Company. The Great Northern built still another sternwheeler for Kootenay Lake in 1900 when they launched the 173-foot Castle, a very graceful ship that was to operate until 1910 when she sank at Ainsworth. That year, Jim Hills Road withdrew from Kootenay Lake, abandoning at the same time its narrow-gauge Castle and Spokane Railway. Meanwhile, it became necessary to increase the Arrow Lake fleet. To manage the expanding company, the C&KSN had brought in Captain Troop, who had been in charge of the Union Pacific's fleet of riverboats in the lower Columbia. He headed the operation until 1898 when he moved to Vancouver to take over supervision of the CPR coastal fleet. Under his direction, the sternwheeler Illecillewaet, a freighter, was designed and built at Revelstoke in 1892. She mainly ran south of Robson, as well as serving as an icebreaker in the upper section of the route during the winter months. CKSN lost the first Arrow Lake ship in 1894 when the Columbia burned near Fort Shepherd just south of Trail. Spokane, as previously mentioned, also burned that year at Caslow. This left the company with only 2 passenger ships on the Columbia River Arrow Lakes route, the Lytton and the Kootenay, and only the Nelson on Kootenay Lake. To replace them, 3 new boats were contracted for in 1895. They were the sternwheelers Nakusp, launched at Nakusp on Dominion Day 1895, and the Trail, a freighter, also for the Arrow Lakes. The third vessel was the screw tug Columbia, 77 feet long, for barge service. Rebuilt in 1920, she gave many more years of service, lasting long after most of the sternwheelers had gone. The C&KSN was taken over by the CPR in 1896 as part of their plan to gain control of transportation in the southern area of the interior of British Columbia. The CPR had long been concerned at the inroads of the Great Northern and other competitive lines which threatened to block plans for a route across southern BC. Under the new ownership, the fleet was enlarged by the addition of the Rossland and a new Kootenay, both for the Arrow Lakes. A third stern-wheeler, the Slocan, was also constructed by the CPR for service on Slocan Lake. She left the waves in 1897. Rebuilt in 1905, the Slocan served until 1927, when she was replaced by the tug Roseberry, which handled Slocan Lake traffic until 1943, when a new and larger tug of the same name was launched. The loss of the Nakuspa fire at Arrowhead in 1897 again reduced the fleet. In 1898, the Minto, originally destined for the Stikine, where the CPR had a fleet of stern-wheelers, was rerouted to the Arrow Lakes, having been shipped out from the east in parts. She was assembled and launched at Nakusp. A sister ship, the Moye, also intended for the Stikine, left the ways at Nelson the same year. Oddly enough, these two stern-wheelers outlived all the other ships on the lakes. Still another steamer service had been established in the Kootenays in 1898 when the 75-foot stern-wheeler Victoria was placed on Trout Lake. She was to have been a link for the railway north from Lardo and a proposed rail extension south from Arrowhead to Trout Lake. During the years 1898 to 1906, only two stern-wheelers were built, an indication of the inroads being made by the railways. One, as noted before, was the Great Northern's Castle, and the other the Revelstoke in 1902 for service above Revelstoke. She ran until 1915, burning at Comatix. CPR increased its Kootenay Lake fleet by building the Kuskonook in 1906. For many years, she handled the Nelson-Kootenay landing route, connecting at the latter point with trains from the Crow and east. 7 years later, she was joined by the largest ship on those waters, the Nisuken, just over 200 feet in length with a 40-foot beam. She continued in operation until completion of the Kootenay Landing Proctor link on the South Rail Line and made her last trip on December the 31st, 1930. Passenger trains replaced her the following day. In 1911, the company had placed the stern-wheeler Bonington, identical to the Nisuken, in service on the Arrow Lakes run. Unlike her predecessors, however, she never ran south of Robson West. Indeed, steamers ran south of Robson after completion of the railway from the trail to that point in 1899, only to carry excursionists north. It is interesting to note that the railway bridge placed across the Columbia at Castlegar was equipped with a swing span at the eastern side, and the span exists today, though it's so completely rusted it would not be operative. Traffic in the Arrow Lakes was adequately handled by the Bonington, Rossland, Minto, and Kootenay until completion of the Kettle Valley Railway from Midway to Hope in 1916, the final link in an all-rail route to the coast. Steamer service in the Arrow Lakes was immediately reduced, and one by one the steamers were taken out of service, the Bonington surviving until the early 1930s. The Minto was the only stern-wheeler left on that lake until she was retired in April of 1954. The Nisuken was purchased by the provincial government, cut down a deck and a half, and used in ferry service on Kootenay Lake until 1947, when she was replaced by the motor ship Anscombe. Other ships on Kootenay Lake were tied up as highways improved. In the 1930s, only one remained, the Moye, which made her last trip in April 1957. The stern-wheelers met various fates. Some burned, some were bought by private interests and individuals for use as floating hotels or floating homes. Little remains today. A pilot house in the Kuskonook stands by the highway a few miles beyond Nelson. Here and there, other remains could be seen until recent years, but time has removed most of the relics. Fortunately, two were preserved as museum pieces, the Moye Caso, somewhat weathered and neglected, and the Sycamoose at Penticton, cut down a deck and a half in the 30s and hardly the same ship she was when launched at Okanagan Landing those many years past. But while the stern-wheelers are gone forever, the memories of journeys on the lakes will always live with us. I was fortunate enough to be permitted in the wheelhouse of the Minto one night on a northward trip up through the fast water below Burton when a deckhand came up to assist the captain with the wheel. Those two men worked with sweat on their brows as they swung the big wheel first one way, then the other, guiding the ship up through the narrow channel where one false move would result in disaster. And on a southbound trip, again in the fast water below Burton, when the morning mists hung low on the river. Rather than risk going aground on the sandbar in the fog, the steamer was expertly run broadside on the beach, held there against the current until visibility improved, when she was eased out into the stream again. Or in the 1950s, to be on board when too close to a sandbar ahead, the engines were reversed, and the steamer was backed up for another try at the narrow channel. Another flashback to the very early days was the sight of a fire on a distant beach in the 1940s or 50s, whereon the steamer would change course and head toward the smoke signal no matter how far away. There, after running the prow hard onto the sandy beach and throwing out the heavy gangplank, a habitant of the area leading his horse would board the boat for the journey to Nakusp or some other point along the lake. Day after day, until the ships were taken out of service in relatively recent years, such scenes would be reenacted. These were the scenes of the long ago, and it is difficult to realize that such events were taking place in our modern times. I think no prettier sight could be seen than that of a glistening white steamer rounding a distant point, smoke wafting from her stack. Presently the sound of a deep-throated whistle alerted all for miles around that the boat was coming. Residents scurried down to the wharf to see who might be getting off and to watch the loading and unloading of freight, while the mail clerk threw off a bag of mail. Express was put ashore, and perhaps several crates of fruit were trundled back into the hold behind the huge boiler. The fireman leaned out of his pit, taking advantage of the short stop to rest his back. One or two passengers embarked, perhaps bound for the faraway city. Then the gangplank would be hauled aboard, the ship's bell would sound, and a brief note would come from the large brass whistle. The engine room telegraph would signal astern. Slow muffled puffs of the stack, wet exhaust steam spooning over those on the dock, and the big ship would majestically back away from the wharf. Again the tinkle of the engine room bells, and then in a surge of water from the paddles, the ship would begin to move forward, off to another port of call. As nightfall came, lights of the small communities along the way would appear on the shoreline, and soon in the distance would be seen a string of lights at the long landing at West Robson, southern terminus of the Arrow Lake Run. The sight never to be forgotten as one watched in the window of the coach of the westbound train as it neared West Robson was a brightly lighted steamer lying at the wharf. And then the train, uncoupled from the last one or two cars, would run down to the ship's side to exchange baggage, express mail, and passengers. Boat night was something to remember. Kerosene lamps lighting the wharf, the bright lights of the Bonington or Minto, whine of the locomotive generator, and the slow, irregular thump of the engine's air pump, and the sound of water slapping against the ship's sides. For those heading north on the lake, a narrow but comfortable berth in the small stateroom with breakfast next morning in a palatial dining room. Similar scenes took place daily at Nelson, Kootenay Landing, Penticton, Okanagan Landing, and Arrowhead, where passenger trains ran down to Lakeside to meet the steamers. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Good, I'm sure after that there'll be a few questions. Mrs. Coombs is jumping up and down your seat here.
Did you know Captain Poison?
No, I didn't know very many of the men. I knew Captain Wright.
I knew Captain Wright, too.
And he is the gentleman who was so kind to let me ride in the pilot house.
Yes, and me too. We used to steer. I was teaching just across from Burton. And we used to go up to the wheelhouse. Captain Wright was very good to us. And he helped us steer the old river.
Oh, yes, he used to do that to us, too.
Captain Poison used to come on in the winter.
Oh, did he?
Yeah. He lived at Needles. Evidently he was excellent at taking the boats up and down. So he just come on.
Well, he was there was one other captain who...
Kirby?
No, he went to Okanagan Lake. No, I can't recall his name at the moment. Retired not too long ago. He worked on the ships as a...
Was Captain Kennedy?
He won't tell me. I met him through a very strange situation years and years ago.
Otto Westerbrook? He was the last skipper on the Minto.
No, this chap was on the Okanagan for many years. He'd been on the Arrow Lakes, not as a captain, and gone to the Okanagan as a captain, and I think he was back on the lakes for one or two trips. But I didn't know him that well. It was a meeting sorry, his name escapes me.
I think Mrs. Wright, as far as I know, is still living.
Oh, is she?
Yeah, she was in Nelson. She was living in Nelson.
She was kind enough to give me some of Captain Wright's old photographs, and Captain Wright did something that was most unusual years ago. He loaned me his entire collection to copy. He didn't know me either, except as a passenger on the boat.
You couldn't give it to a better person.
All my hobby is fish marks. Others come with suggesting food. And I have the postmarks of the Rossland Arrowhead translation
possible that it wasn't necessary on the Kootenay Lake, I suppose. The run on the Arrow Lakes was much longer and probably more points at which mail was put on and off, very much like the railway trains. If you had a cancellation, then this indicated that there were facilities for sorting mail on the Arrow Lakes boats. Now, I have not come across that to the extent that I would be willing to say there was such a facility as a government post office mail room, such as on the trains.
There are many cancels between Medicine Hat and Nelson. It's quite possible that this is one road, a whole variety of inmates and that happened, was wrong like that, but I have them all.
Well, those would be the cancellations in the mail car on that particular run.
Up to the landing. It's quite possible that a lot of mail will be put onto the boat, and intermediate points up and down the lake.
But sacked to be sorted in the next car.
Although I do have rather an interesting postcard, my uncle, I should say, was the place of landing, the Balfour. And they had friends at Proctor, who sent on the 23rd of December, they put a postcard on the, I think from the super possibly, and it's got a rubber stamp across it, and a Proctor DC, not a cancellation, postmaster initiated. It arrived at Nelson on the 24th of December, where Nelson canceled on it, and it arrived at Balfour on the 25th of December. So from Proctor, a quarter of a mile across the lake to Balfour, it took 2 days, from the 23rd to the 25th.
Well, the reason would be lack of sorting facilities between Kootenay Landing and Nelson.
I assume so, if there wasn't, because I haven't found it.
See, on the trains there were sorting facilities, Nelson to Midway only. And during the period of time on that run, mail would be sorted for all points from there right into east of Penticton. Although I would suspect that Penticton would be the final point, and from there separate bags would be put on the train and handled by the train baggageman.
There were Hope and Vancouver canceled.
But there were no mail car between Hope and Midway.
But there were plenty between Penticton and Northern Ireland. I have those two.
Then there must have been a mail cart on that boat.
Going up that way on the boat.
So they sorted mail on the boat as on that boat.
Very interested in that aspect. So I'd like to see the most.
Well, I don't have too much in that sort of thing. I rely on people like yourself to tell me that there were cancellations from these ships, which indicated that there were railway government postal offices on them. Well, you have it. I'd like to see them.
I've got a lot of several postcards on the ship.
Well, there's some interesting stories in the book I just read, the Klondike here in Basin. And there's some stories there about Sternwheelers were built on the Yukon River.
Mm-hmm.
And at the height of the Klondike of 1897, there were 7,300 boats on the Yukon River at one time. And these were launched in 2 days to go down the Yukon River to the Klondike. And there were some interesting stories here on the Sternwheelers that had been built by some of the more, the well-junior processors. And it's an interesting story, it's an interesting boats. This could add to your collection of history. There were boats from dugouts to Peterborough from the Sternwheelers. 7,000 boats, not to quite a sight.
It's a lot of boats.
Start out with the Yukon and the gold strike in 1897. Good story.
Well, what boat did you go down on? Down the Yukon on, aren't you? Did you go on the Sternwheeler?
Yes, I was on a Sternwheeler from Whitehorse to Dawson. Most of the straight over to the mail.
I would think that every major river and lake in the west, Sternwheelers, one time or another, certainly what I covered today, was just a brief account of our immediate district, but not too many years ago, a stern-wheeler could be seen at Kamloops, tied up down by the city park, if I remember correctly. The stern-wheeler could be seen along the Fraser near New Westminster. And our first trip to Portland in 1956, I believe it was, there was an old stern-wheeler tied up in the Willamette near Portland. And many of them survived, I suppose, rather than destroy them. They were just left tied up. Perhaps they served a purpose in those late years. But certainly the most interesting of all were the three large ships on our Okanagan, Kootenay, and Arrow Lakes runs, the Missouken, the Bonington, and the Sycamoose. Probably the largest ships ever built in the West. I'm sure they must have been the largest riverboat ever built in the West. And they were very, very beautiful ships inside and out. There were sister ships. About the only difference between the three of them was the top deck on the Sycamoose was shorter because of crew requirements, I suppose, for sleeping quarters. Wasn't quite as heavy as that on the other boats, which had longer runs.
Do you know the story of raising up the boats from the water to Ainsworth? That must have been quite an undertaking to get them out of the water.
I don't know how they did it, but many of them went down at one time or another. The Rossland went down at the cusp at one time, was raised. Apparently a new hull was put under her. That would be an accomplishment in itself. But it wasn't unusual for these boats to go down. It's just amazing to me that the Minto on the Arrow Lakes was able to go up and down through that fast water all those years, you know. And this little experience that I told you of the night I was up in the pilot house, believe me, and I tell you, those two men worked with that wheel. And Captain Wright was a man in his early 60s at that time. Far too much for a man of his age to have been doing. And you had to see it to believe it. And no one down below had the faintest idea of what was going on. And at that time of the year, the river was low, you see. And it was quite an accomplishment.
They used to dredge it. Nearly every year they used to put big dredges in to try and keep that swift water out.
But even so, the channel would be narrow too, you see. And then coming down, of course, when the water was fast, they worked full steam. The faster the ship could be made to go, the better the chances of keeping control of it. I don't know what speeds they actually made in that river. I think probably the top speed of any of them was 18 knots, wasn't it? Which is pretty fast for a riverboat.
Did you ever listen to the stories that Jim Lindsay told in the early days? His grandfather had the first story there.
No, I haven't. But
There are quite a few interesting stories on things here. In the early days, there were several people from England coming in to go farming, and one of these old chaps ordered 24 chickens. He lived about 7 miles up in the woods or back in the valley. Jim helped him pack the chickens off the boat, you know, or off the dock up there. He decided they were too heavy to carry into the branch, so he left them all loose and tried to hurt them. It's not very funny detail, but we used to hear Jim.
well, I suppose there were some very humorous stories. I can recall one of a chap who worked at Cominco, and he was quite well known for his drinking habits. And I knew him. He came in to me one day at the office, and he was on holidays, said he was going up to Halcyon. Away he went, caught the steamer out to Halcyon, but I guess it was, 2 days later. I met him on the street and asked him what happened. Well, I didn't like it, so I came home. But I learned the story sometime later from another passenger on the boat. This chap had met a friend on the boat, and between them they'd consumed a fair amount of whiskey, I guess. Now, this isn't many years ago. He went to he got off the ship at Halcyon, all right, and was standing on the wharf waving goodbye to his friend, and he toppled into the water. Well, as you know, the old chap who ran the Halcyon Hot Springs didn't believe in drink or tobacco, as I recall. He had him on the boat southbound the next day. Quite a job fishing him out of the lake.
Well, just that cold water sobered him up.
I bet it did too, temporarily anyway.
There's a story about the old fellow in the copy came in on the Sternwheelers. He was backing away from the wharf and he had a brand new bottle of him, so he took the cork out and he was supposed to have a drink. And he noticed a fellow on the, he was just lifting this sort of a gangplank. He noticed the fellow on the shore and hadn't seen for years. So he followed him and said, "Hey, Bill, come on and have a drink." And he decided he's going to get off. So this time he was about 10 feet from the shore, so he just stepped into the lake with his bottle of whiskey in his hand. And he came up with his finger in the bottle, he let it off the ground.
Well, then the water was high on the Yarrow Lake. There were quite a number of teachers from around this district up on the Yarrow Lake. When the water was high, you see, the boat couldn't come in. And so the maids would go out and pick up these little teachers and carry them on board the boat.
Is that right?
Yeah.
One of those fascinating sights I saw in Bonnie coming down. I think we stopped at the festival there. Came down in Bonnie and we were the festival and stopped at some luggage plant. And the water got on. We were all dressed up for the city. And we had a pair of ankle high dress boots. Beautiful in bright yellow. And they were buttoned up the sides. And the only way to get in out was to get a button hook. I remember the button hooks.
I remember the button hooks too when I was a youngster.
Was there much loss of life in all these paintings and buildings?
Oh, I think there were a few people lost in the various things that were bound to be. I don't know how many. I'm sure it's written in here and there. Surely the Ainsworth, for example, and Castle. Not the yes, the Castle. Well, I doubted the Castle because it went aground close to shore. But there must have been some loss of life. In fact, there were on some of the earlier, two of the earlier boats on Kootenay Lake. I think loss of life is mentioned in the Ainsworth. I've forgotten. It's so long since I've done any work on my collection or the history of the boats. I'm a little hazy about many things.
Why did so many of them burn?
Well, it's a wonder that more of them really didn't burn when you consider their construction, and they were very flimsily built, you know, and there was flammable material everywhere, I suppose. Wouldn't be so much from sparks as probably from perhaps a fire in the galley or anywhere. It's hard to say. But it's quite interesting, and I was very unhappy to read in Newsweek 2 or 3 issues past where the Delta Queen was condemned. Perhaps some of you have read of the Delta Queen, that fine sternwheeler that still operates from Cincinnati, I believe it is, right as far south as New Orleans. It's a most wonderful trip, which I one day had hoped to make, but never will. However, it was condemned because of its wooden superstructure, which is rather a shame because, after all, they're wooden structures. And any other?
Well, we were on occasion to ride on the one in Calgary at the Heritage Museum.
Oh yes, we went out on that one day with the youngsters. That's very interesting too. There's one
This one was built in Calgary, wasn't it?
oh, I would think so. There's one at Disneyland too that cruises around a pond. I believe there's one at Salt Lake City in the park. No, that's a very small effort.
The whole Nelson Midnight Cruises. I was
Nelson. Mhm. They were pretty to see. Well, this is the sort of thing that makes you wonder. Oh, I suppose as time went on, their firefighting equipment was improved and a little more readily available, if there was any in the early days at all, except buckets on the deck, you know. And they had pumps on the later ships that could pump water. On the early ships, I suppose they relied entirely on the bucket brigade.
The steamer Rossland is, of course, the one that is of special interest to us. Ed Vipond, of course, retired in Victoria. He spends a lot of time in the archives there, and last spring he sent us a series of 3 pictures of it was on the steamer Rossland. Its original stage, and I believe the upper deck was added to, and we had a picture of that, and we had a third picture of it at the cusp when it capsized. I believe it capsized because it was tied up there for the winter and nobody bothered to shovel the snow load on it. But here was the Rossland over on its side, tied up alongside, I suppose, the mine, and I'm just forgetting how it had to look.
It's an interesting picture.
Well, supposed to be in the fastest boat in the world.
That's what I understand. My recollection of from what I was told or have read about the Rossland was that it was capsized because of that slide at Arrowhead. It sent a tidal wave down
This
this.
could happen too, but this particular picture showing it at the cusp. And,
Pardon me, at the cusp is where it capsized.
that's where it was.
But
And
there is
Edison
no
also
tidal wave.
made up a bit of history. He delved through the material and typed history for us as well.
For those
The
people.
Maritime Museum in Victoria a few years ago was a very fine display. Probably paintings, beautiful paintings, of all the ships. Somebody had a collection.
Was that Garner's paintings? He did it.
Garner did some
Garner did a
beautiful
series. Was that his name?
I don't think that they may have been, but I don't know. As long as somebody in Victoria, and there's nothing in America.
Could have been Garner's.
Yes, the others.
There was a model of the Minto, I believe it was, in the Museum of Victoria too.
That was a pity that that boat had to be burned out in the lake. I couldn't.
Well, nobody would take it up and
I
spend
thought
money.
of it.
Didn't have any wharf at the house, or did they just?
Oh, they had a
wharf.
wharf there. It was a concrete wharf, wasn't it?
Well, it wouldn't work last time.
Pardon me? Heavy.
We had the incorporation papers for the House in Hot Springs Hotel in our archives. We were back in Montreal.
Well, I haven't been up since my last trip on the boat, of course. No other way up there.
Again, O'Byrne built that little chapel to his wife that she's buried in. It's kept in beautiful shape.
Will that be flooded? It will.
No, I would say it's high enough about I was quite interested in that because General Byrne left the whole property to Marshal Tito, Yugoslavia.
Did he?
So Tito wrote the Trail Rock and Gun Club, said he would give it to them if they would hold it forever for their use of the members. So we were going to build a little, little camp for our members, but then the relations got together and broke the rest. It would have made a beautiful place to have, but we got 600-700 members from them, probably got a lot of it.
Why did he visit the general special Tito?
He was probably the finest man we ever had. And his wife was from there too.
Burnham was the charge of the medical services for the Montenegro Marine in the first war. Susan General and Skad Montenegro Balkan Recreation.
Another thing we acquired last year was a timetable put out by the Crown Point Hotel showing the scheduled meets between the Columbia and Western train to Rossland and the steamer Lytton Trail to connect with the railway.
There's some fast water down there too. Around the Dalles, they go into the North Fork. I know you wonder how.
Well, the Dalles were past North Fork.
They didn't go below the Dalles.
They were visible this spring. Was it this spring when the water was so very low?
We went down to the Victoria.
Last year, my wife and I went down to the old town site of Marcus.
They actually broke the little oasis. There's a couple of iron
Snubbing boots? Were they snubbing boots?
Yeah, snubbing that the boats used to hold. They're still.
Are they still there?
And that's the way they were. My father came up, in my part, by boat, and they had to be pulled up in this water. He came up, I think, in June.
I've often thought that I should get a couple of people to get on and pick those up.
Certainly.
The steamer Rossland was the only one that didn't have to use the snubbing boots. Trail and casting guys.
That must-
the trail, where did the trail set?
trail was a freighter. It was used in the Robson Arrowhead Run.
Where's the Columbia Narrows?
Columbia Narrows? Do you mean between the two lakes?
I don't know. I don't
Yes.
picture the trail tied up at the Columbia Narrows or on something else.
Is this a statement I made?
No, I have a picture
Oh,
of it. I
oh,
just
have
wonder
you?
if
Columbia
could tell me
Narrows. I don't know
it
where
is.
the Columbia Narrows will be. There's a Narrows at just up from West Robson at Syringa.
That's what it's called.
I don't know what other Narrows it would refer to.
It was just about Stringer. It was just below some.
Just below Syringa there, where the point is, or the river joining the two lakes. I don't know where else the Columbia Narrows would be.
Well, it could be a mistake. They did make mistakes in postcards. I have a postcard which is entitled Bonington and Coeur d'Alene Fall in the Kootenay River. Well, it's obviously Bonington and Coeur d'Alene.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the Coeur d'Alene.
I had a picture of the Kuskook that I bought on the Kuskook, or a picture of the Nasukan, I guess it was, that I bought on the Kuskook one day, and it's titled the Kuskook. It's wrong. These mistakes were made. Mainly they were made by the people who submitted them to.
You mentioned the Kootenay. I recall being tied up in Nelson Shipyard, and I was mentioning this to Richie Dean one day, and he said, yeah, his father bought the Kootenay, took it up to Dean's Haven, and they operated it as a floating restaurant for a couple of
Oh,
years.
is that
It was years to years.
It was his stuff.
How far south did they go in Columbia? Into the states, the Sternwheelers?
Well, it's mentioned in one place where a certain ship had come from Colville, which is impossible, because Colville isn't on the Columbia River. But it could have been from a point near Colville, not too far away. Some of them were built at the Little Dells, which is pretty fast water, and I don't imagine ships running that unnecessarily, really.
Well, there's a fall just about the Kettle Falls Bridge. We were down there 4 years ago, and the river was at its lowest. And that fall was 100 feet high.
Well, that would be at Kettle Falls, where the two railway bridges are. Yes, I remember that. That was Kettle Falls. As it was, those were the Kettle Falls.
But there were no boats that would go below that.
Oh, no. I think the Little Dells was probably the southern terminus of any ship. One or two were built down there. And I can't say I don't know the Dells that well. I remember seeing them years ago from the train. It was pretty fast water and pretty narrow in there. But then they navigated pretty fast waters up in the Yukon and other rivers of British Columbia too. So perhaps it wasn't impossible. But one ship is mentioned as having being built at Colville. So this would be down below Colville somewhere in Columbia and brought up. But you see, the Spokane Falls and Northern reached the Little Dells in 1890. And if anything had gone down before that, it certainly wasn't necessary after then, because this was a point of connection.
You mentioned the 49, is that what they call it, 49?
Mm-hmm.
I was looking through Warren Oberlin's notes the other day, and I noticed that he had actually chartered the 49er to take a trip up to Revelstoke.
Was that right? Well, he
With
was
a survey party.
I was going to say, he was a surveyor with for the CPR.
No, he was with the provincial government.
Provincial government, was it? Oh.
In fact,